Good morning. What a joyful day today. He is risen, and we've come here to celebrate. Yeah, look at that. Very good. Good Anglicans. And so for those the smaller ones amongst us who have got comic strips in front of you, good luck with trying to keep up with the story. There might be some fast-drawing boxes. There might be some slow-drawing ones. What we're going to do today is we're going to walk through the story of Lazarus. Now, some of you are going to know this story. Some of you might not know it. But it's actually pointing towards Jesus' own death and resurrection. It happens before that. But there's a profound moment in the story that I really want us to dwell on. Now, when I think about kind of good times, I particularly think about friends and enjoying life with friends. I'm hoping this weekend you might have some good times with friends, because that's a really good thing. Jesus had friends. Maybe we've got to sort of just sit and think about that for a moment. Jesus actually had friends. He wasn't just all business, right? He developed friendships. He spent time with people. And he actually taught people a lot in life, in walking alongside them, in sharing life, in facing challenges. He taught them much about the kingdom of God in those moments. And so today, as we walk through this story, I'm going to be using the pictures from this book that Rach mentioned, Goodbye to Goodbyes. It's a wonderful book by Lauren Chandler and Catalina. I should have practiced that last name. It's a great book. And you can see a link to it in the QR code. But I'm also going to have the text appear next to the pictures so that we can read through John 11 together. And just like Jesus would stop in the middle of kind of life circumstances and teach, I'm going to actually stop in moments and ask us to reflect. And I'm going to ask some questions. And so there might be sort of moments to yell out answers. You don't have to start your answers with Jesus is risen, but you could. And then, as Rach said, at the end of this, I'm actually going to open the floor. I'm going to walk around with a microphone for anyone who would like to share a bit about how the hope of Jesus has changed their life. Because if Jesus really did rise from the dead, then nothing is the same again. All right, so this is the story of Lazarus, and it starts like this. There was once a man named Lazarus who was sick. He lived in the town of Bethany, where Mary and her sister Martha lived. Mary is the woman who later put perfume on the Lord and wiped his feet with her hair. Mary's brother was Lazarus, and that man was now sick. It's interesting to think that in life, we can't help but notice that there are times that things aren't going well. In this case, a good friend of Jesus is suffering quite significantly. And so Mary and Martha sent someone to tell Jesus, Lord, the one you love is sick. Why would they go to Jesus? Why would they not go to a doctor, perhaps? Why would they go to Jesus? Anyone? He's free. He bulked bills, yes. Why else would they go to Jesus? He's a healer. So they knew that he had done great things. But also, he is a friend. And even when our friends are not doctors, do we still not go to them and say, friend, I'm struggling. Something's going wrong in my life, and I need your comfort. We don't even ask this sometimes, but that's what we're implying, right? We need comfort. We need friends. And so Mary and Martha sent word to Jesus. This is not the day and age where you can call up that kind of telehealth hotline. You can't text a friend. You can't send an email. You would have to send a messenger, and that would take a while. In fact, Jesus is on the other side of the Jordan River. And that would take a little while, maybe more than a day, to send a messenger out to Jesus, for Jesus to get the message and then to come back. That's kind of 2 days. That's a long time to get a doctor, especially if someone is sick, right? And so this is what happened. So the messenger went to Jesus, and then when Jesus heard this, he said, this sickness will not end in death. It is for the glory of God. Now see how Jesus is sort of teaching in the moment of life here. This has happened, he says, to bring glory to the Son of God, referring to himself. Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus, but when he heard that Lazarus was sick, he stayed where he was for 2 more days. Does that strike you as a bit odd? Jesus does odd kind of things at times. And the reason he does odd things is that we might stop and notice. So there's two things here. One, we're expecting that this will end well because Jesus has said this will not end in death. This will end for the glory of God. But also just to kind of, maybe add to the drama, I'm just going to chill out for a little bit longer. But maybe that's not what the messenger was expecting. The messenger at this point would have been pleading, no doubt, no, Jesus, I don't think you understand. Lazarus is really sick. Then Jesus said to his followers, let us go back to Judea. So after a moment of waiting, and the followers said, but teacher, the Jews there tried to kill you with stones. That was only a short time ago. Have you forgotten Jesus? Now you want to go back there? As Jesus did great miracles, as someone at the back already made reference to, he drew a great crowd, but he was also a threat to the religious leaders of the day because he was doing something very different. And people who were following the leaders of the day were kind of leaving to follow Jesus. So he was a threat to the establishment, so much so that actually, and the things that Jesus even claimed, particularly that he was the Son of God, caused such offense that the religious leaders actually tried to kill Jesus. The disciples know this because they're kind of hanging around Jesus. They don't want to get in on that action, right? And so how is Jesus going to weigh up the risk of caring for his friend versus caring for himself? This is what Jesus says. And this is a bit odd too, right? I said Jesus says odd things sometimes. Jesus answered, are there not 12 hours in the day? If anyone walks in the daylight, he will not stumble because he can see by this world's light. But if anyone walks at night, he stumbles because there is no light to help him see. Can anyone help me understand what Jesus is talking about here? This is not rhetorical. What might Jesus be referring to? The disciples have just said, whoa, let's not go back there because we might get killed. And then Jesus responds with this. Anyone got an idea even? You might be like the disciples, following Jesus going, yeah, we'll follow, but I don't know what you're talking about. Yeah. Yeah, okay, great. Walking in the light means you're safe, and walking in the darkness means you stumble. I think, we understand what it's like to stumble and trip in the darkness, and that's what life is like when you don't have faith in Jesus. But Jesus is the light of the world. And even if you don't understand in full, if you walk in his light, let him show you the way. Now, that's only opening up kind of like, it's not giving you the answer. It's just saying that Jesus is worth following and that he will show us in his light. And so he goes on. After Jesus said this, he added, our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, but I'm not going there to wake him. The followers said, but Lord, if he can sleep, he will get well. They sort of get it, don't they? But they're not really. When we say someone's fallen asleep, what might we mean? They died. Yeah, that's a really polite, careful way of saying that someone might have died. Now the disciples are like, now if he's asleep and he's not well, that's a good thing. Let him rest. Don't wake him up. But Jesus meant that Lazarus was dead. Jesus' followers thought he meant Lazarus was just sleeping. And so then Jesus says really plainly, Lazarus is dead. Now what's happening here? Because Jesus already said, what did he say at the beginning? Again, not rhetorical? Yep. That it won't end in death. And now here we are. Jesus actually knows that Lazarus is dead. How did that happen? And how did Jesus know all this? Remember, Jesus is not there. And I'm glad for your sakes, Jesus says, that I was not there, so that you may believe. So that you may believe. Let us go. Then Thomas, the one called Didymus, said to the other disciples, let us go too. We will die with him. Such faith. But it's also sounding very dramatic because now we have all these tensions in play. There is the drama of the threat to Jesus and his disciples because Jesus is the king, and that is a threat to the establishment. And so what might happen there? But there's also this, Jesus said he's not going to end in death, but he's died. And so what's going to happen? Jesus arrived in Bethany. There he learned that Lazarus had already been dead and in the tomb for 4 days. So that's pretty dead. Bethany was about 2 miles from Jerusalem, and many Jews had come there to comfort Martha and Mary about their brother. Now, this would have been quite a scene. When I go to funerals, and I've led funerals, usually they're very quiet. There might be, some very reserved tears from the front, sometimes a bit more, but quite often in Australia, we are quite reserved in our emotions, particularly in the public setting. For those of you that are from countries around the world, you might have a very different experience of funerals. In ancient Jewish culture, they would actually hire professional mourners to wail, to make a commotion. And it was actually, that's a good thing, I think, in the sense that death is not okay, and we should be deeply not okay with it. And so let us kind of weep and wail for the grip that death has on us. And so Jesus would have walked into this commotion of people weeping and wailing, and there at the center of it are his friends. Martha heard that Jesus was coming, and she went out to meet him, but Mary stayed at home. Martha said to Jesus, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. But I know that even now, God will give you anything you ask." Let's just think about that statement for a moment. What do you think she's feeling? Help us understand what she might be feeling. There's a couple of things I think here. Kids or adults, help us think about what Martha is feeling at this very moment. Let down, I think that's massive. Jesus, I reached out to you a few days ago. You took your time getting here, and now my brother's dead. That's pretty huge. What else might he be feeling? She feeling? Yes. Faith. Because there's this last bit, right? But I know that even now God will give you anything you ask. What does that even mean? It's over. He's dead. Up the back there, Oscar, was that your hand? Yeah, what do you want to say? Or bigger. A bit mad at Jesus. Yeah, I think that's a good way of expressing that being let down, being angry at Jesus. And actually, if we read the Psalms back in the middle of the Bible here, you'll find lots of words that God's given us to give back to him, and some of those are deep anguish. And it's actually God's big enough, and our faith is real and personal enough for us to be real with God. And I think Martha would have been angry in a whole bunch of ways. And yet there is this faith, there is this tension. Sometimes our feelings are actually a tension of a number of things. And so there Jesus comforts Martha as Martha expresses how she is feeling. Isn't that a wonderful picture of God with us in Jesus as he embraces us in actually how we feel? Jesus said, "Your brother will rise and live again." This is the answer to her comment that I know that even now God will give you whatever you ask. And here comes this promise that her brother will rise again. But Martha answered, "I know that he will rise and live again in the resurrection on that last day." Now, at one level, this is quite an unusual statement. We might be familiar, if you're familiar with the kind of Christian story about the resurrection. But the resurrection was not a common idea back in that day. They didn't necessarily believe like we do, because Jesus has given us a clarity of the resurrection and of heaven. But this is quite a statement of faith. But notice that even in this statement of faith, it's quite distant. On that last day, I know that, and I'm looking forward to that, Jesus, but right now, I'm devastated. And again, she's holding in tension this faith and this present feeling. But Jesus said to her, "I am the resurrection and the life." Jesus said, "I am the resurrection and the life. He who believes in me will have life even if he dies. And he who lives and believes in me will never die." Martha, do you believe this? Here is one of these profound I am statements that Jesus makes throughout John, making a claim about himself, and he does it in the reality of this situation. He is claiming that he is the source of life, the creator, the God who made us, the one who gave us life and gives us life. But he's also saying that if you are joined with me, and this is for all of us, if you are joined with me, then you will not die. but you will have eternal life, now and forever. Do you believe this? Jesus says to Martha, says to us. Martha answered, "My Lord, yes, Lord. I believe that you are the Christ, the Son of God. You are the one who was coming to the world." Now, can someone help me understand here? Christ, is that Jesus' surname, or is that kind of something a bit more important? What does it mean for Jesus to be the Christ? God's anointed king. Might need even more explanation than that. Anointed. What are we going with there? Chosen. Yep. He's the one the whole Old Testament was pointing to, because the whole Old Testament is about God who made us. We who said, "No, thank you, God, we don't need you," that all goes bad. And then God pursues us in his love, raises up leaders who fail but still point towards God's ultimate solution and salvation. And really, all the prophets in the Old Testament are pointing to the one who will bring about salvation, who will fix all things, who will make all sad things come untrue, who will rise even over death. Now, the people of the day had all kinds of versions of this person in their minds, particularly even kind of like a leader who would help Israel rise up against their enemies, the Romans, and kind of overthrow them and be this kind of powerful force again. But people who had that version in their mind didn't see this Jesus, because here he is alongside the broken, talking about something quite profoundly different. After Martha said this, she went back to her sister Mary. She talked to Mary alone. And Martha said, "The teacher is here and is asking for you." Now notice that it's not just our friend. That, we all have friends, but we don't have friends that are Son of God necessarily walking alongside us. Well, we do, but not like these guys, right? And so they recognize that, that yes, Jesus is our friend, but he's teaching. He's saying some stuff here that we need to pay attention to. When Mary heard this, she got up quickly and went to Jesus. Jesus had not yet come into the town. He was still at the place where Martha had met him. The Jews were with Mary in the house, comforting her. They saw Mary stand up and leave quickly. They followed her, thinking that she was going to the tomb to cry there. And so again, the commotion kind of follows Mary, and Jesus would have been confronted by a kind of quite a scene, I suppose. But Mary went to the place where Jesus was. And when she saw him, she fell at his feet and said, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." It's the same frustration, the same anger even. But Jesus this time doesn't give an answer. Sometimes we kind of have these questions of why God, and we want this neat little answer that will kind of solve all the problems. But actually God gives us something bigger than that. He gives us a person. He gives us a who, not a why. Jesus saw that Mary was crying and that the Jews who came with her were crying too. Jesus felt very sad in his heart and was deeply troubled. Now, that's a kind of very soft translation. You know that kind of feeling where you have that deep, deep anguish, where your guts are tied in knots and you feel kind of just, the word gutted, that kind of is actually kind of that your guts kind of like feeling all messed up, right? Do you know that feeling? Some of us would have experienced this when we've been confronted by something deeply troubling. Jesus has this feeling right now. Why? He's actually said this is going to end in God's glory. Why is he feeling kind of like this? Well, firstly, he is fully man. Yes, he's fully God, but he's also fully man. And so he has feelings. We ought to notice that. He asks, and again, instead of answering kind of questions, he says, "Where did you bury him?" Now, Jesus would have known that, I'm sure. But nonetheless, he speaks into kind of the situation. And here comes the shortest sentence in the whole Bible. "Come and see, Lord," they said. And Jesus cried. What do you make of that? Jesus wept. Why is Jesus crying? Anyone want to help me out here? Why is Jesus crying? Because he's human. Yep. What's that? His friend has died. He really has friends. And as he's kind of confronted by death, it actually really moves him. But I think there's also something more going on here. So the Jews said, "See how much he loved him." Yes, that's what we're meant to see. We're meant to see how much Jesus loved him. But some of them said, if Jesus healed the eyes of the blind man, why didn't he keep Lazarus from dying? That's a good question. And Jesus even said this wouldn't end in death. And Mary and Martha had reached out to Jesus because he was a miracle worker. Again, Jesus felt very sad in his heart, that kind of deep anguish. He came to the tomb, and the tomb was a cave with a large stone covering the entrance. And Jesus said, move the stone away. Now, I think one of the reasons why Jesus is feeling deeply troubled, it's not the same kind of deeply troubled that we feel. When we have someone that we love die, that's the end. We feel gripped by the power of death. We are deeply grieved. It's out of our control. But all of this is within Jesus' control. And so his grief is not quite the same as ours. I actually think as he looks at the crowd around, even as he says, I am the life and the resurrection, he looks at the hopelessness of the crowd. He looks at how much they're gripped by death, even as he says, I am the life and I am the resurrection. He looks at their doubts, their struggle, and he is moved by them. Do you see what's happening in this story? Jesus said, move the stone away. Martha said, but Lord, it has been 4 days since he died. There will be a bad smell. It's very, very, very raw and real there. That's my brother. Martha was the sister of the dead man. Yes, we know that. So they moved the stone away from the entrance. And then Jesus looked up and said, Father, I thank you that you heard me. Look at his faith, even while we struggle in our faith. Jesus knows he's in control. Thank you that you've heard me. I know that you always hear me, but I said these things because of the people around me. I am moved because of the people around me. I'm saying these things because of the people around me. I want them to believe that you sent me. There is a purpose here. And Jesus said this. He cried out in a loud voice. In fact, let's all say it together. It's a loud voice, right? 1, 2, 3. Lazarus, come out. And I have no doubt people around Jesus would have gone, this guy is off his rocks. I can't believe he's just desecrated the tomb and is now screaming into it. That guy is dead. But the dead man came out. That would have rocked the crowd. His hands and his feet were wrapped with pieces of cloth, and he had a cloth around his face. It would have been quite a sight. Could you imagine it? And what happens after that, of course, is that what was broken is now fixed. What was sad has now been made untrue. What was the source of much grief is now the source of joy, because Jesus is the life and the resurrection. This isn't some party trick. This is a way for people to see that Jesus really does have power over death, that we might actually trust him, that he's actually sent by God. And so they party. Friendship is made beautiful again. Life over death. It is a profound story, a wonderful story. We all have to say goodbyes at times. This is the story that this is the kind of the theme of this book, that we all have to say goodbye at some time. Sometimes that means saying goodbye as a friend moves across the world. Sometimes it means we say goodbye because someone we loved has died. But when Jesus says, I am the life and the resurrection, if you believe in me, you will not die, but have life. Jesus is inviting us to say goodbye to goodbyes, because all who trust in Jesus will be raised again and will be reunited with those that we love. This is the book that I was mentioning. You can also grab a copy of a book, a free ebook called Is Easter Unbelievable? As you unpack whether this story, the story of Jesus' own death and resurrection, is actually believable. We're called to actually apply our brains. We're called to bring forth our feelings of doubt and struggle and raise them up to God. But I encourage you to wrestle with that with Jesus, with a faith that says, if you'd been here, you would have fixed this, but also I know that God will give you what you ask. But the resurrection has consequences. This story can't just happen and then you go back to normal life. Could you imagine that? Could you imagine actually being one of Jesus' friends? And kind of like, you'd be talking around town, right? Like, have you heard that Lazarus, you know the guy that died, he's actually back at my house. That would be quite a thing. Surely the resurrection changes everything. Well, do you know what happened next in the story? It doesn't really major on the party back at Lazarus' house. It actually majors on the plot to kill Jesus. Because the resurrection has consequences. If the resurrection is true, then Jesus is who he says he is. He is the Son of God. He is the one who has power to forgive, power to give us life, but also he is Lord over us. And if you don't want that, if you don't like that, then that's a threat. And it certainly was to the religious leaders. And the irony is just dripping out of this passage where Jesus says, I am the life and the resurrection. And the religious leaders said, let's kill him. But you know what? While John doesn't say, the Gospel of John doesn't say, Lazarus would have died again, which is unfortunate. We will all face death one day, which is why Jesus actually dealt with a bigger problem. Not just kind of raising someone who's sick, but dealing with the problem behind sickness and death and suffering, and that is our sin. That is that thing that we said to God, actually, we don't need you. And when we cut ourselves off from the source of life, then there is no life. But God, in his mercy, in his love for us, pursued us, and Jesus died for us so that we would not die. And Jesus rose again on the third day. That's what we're celebrating this Easter. Rose again so that we would have life. And that changes everything. God's not asleep. He's not distant. Death is not the end. But also it's God's glorious stamp to say, this is the one. This is the way. Will you believe? It's the same question that Jesus put to Mary and Martha. The same question put to us. Will you believe that this is God's one? His Son. This is the way. And even as Jesus calls us to take up our cross and follow him, which is hard, this is the stamp to say this is the way. I'm going to raise Jesus from the dead just like I'll raise you. How has this changed your life? For believers who have been living this message out for a while, how has this changed your life? I'm going to put us on the floor in a second. Let me share one thing in my own reflections on this. I am an optimist by kind of temperament, I suppose. But I think the gospel has given me a gospel optimism. And I actually think all Christians ought to have a gospel optimism. And what I mean by that is that it will all work out gloriously in the end. You know, optimists are those annoying people that no matter what happens, it's fine, it's good. But a gospel optimism enables us to actually look at the hard things in this world, the bad, the sad things, and know that that is not the end. And it doesn't mean that kind of, a gospel optimism doesn't mean kind of like, don't worry about it, she's all good. Ultimately, it might mean that actually going through hard things, going through sad things, actually is part of the cross to resurrection story. Maybe some of you right now are going through some hard things, some sad things. Know that that might be part of God's story for you from cross to resurrection. But know that God is with you in that. That will change your hope. That will change the way you live. And so here we are. How has the hope in Jesus as the life and the resurrection changed your life?